Logical positivism is one of the most influential, important, and interesting philosophical movements of the 20th century. In recent years, it has fallen under some heavy criticism and really declined in importance. But I would argue that such critics often fail to see the logical positivists in their own historical context. In fact, I would argue the positivists were responding to two important phenomena in their environment, and it's those phenomena which help us to understand what motivated the emergence of logical positivism in the first place. The first of these phenomena was the profusion of speculative metaphysical systems that had begun in the 19th century and run through the early 20th century in what we might call the post-Kantian epoch. We might think here of Hegelian idealism, of Schopenhauer's claim that the world is will and representation, of Bergson's embrace of the élan vital, all of which, from a positivist point of view, threaten to reduce philosophy to a series of equally absurd flights of imaginative and speculative fancy. So the logical positivists felt it was their duty in defending philosophy to find some way of eliminating these speculative flights of fancy on behalf of a more scientific understanding of the discipline. Hence, the positivism of logical positivism. And by positivism, we mean a belief in positive knowledge or science. So we might think of it then as an embracing of the scientific method and scientific knowledge against metaphysical speculation. The second phenomenon, equally important, was the culmination of a revolution in symbolic logic that had begun in the 19th century with the work of Cantor and Boole, and really took off with the work of Frege and the foundational mathematical researches of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead in Principia Mathematica. What this revolution had done was, beginning in the 19th century, there was an attempt to make logic every bit as formulaic and rational, demonstrative as, say, mathematics. And what had resulted was a development of an incredibly rich symbolic system. It was Boole who first developed the truth functional calculus, the binomial logic whose ultimate fruit takes the form of our computing today. Suffice it to say that by the early 20th century, a first-order and second-order logic had been developed such that one could prove within the grammatic and syntactic rules of that logic that those systems were both consistent and complete, which meant that everything true in those languages of first and second order logic could be proven, and everything that was proven in those languages must be true. And both of those claims, consistency and completeness, were in fact provable within that language. So that by the time you got to the early 20th century, figures like Russell and Whitehead no longer wanted to construct a logic as rigorous as mathematics, because logic was already far more syntactically and grammatically rigorous than mathematics. Instead, the project became to try to reduce mathematics to pure logic, to, given a small number of logical rules, recursively build all of mathematics. And indeed, you could begin by recursively building all of symbolic logic from simply two operators. Knowing how to use the word and not, one could build the rest of symbolic logic, and from that, ideally, build all of mathematics. And this was the logical part of logical positivism. Positivists deployed this symbolic logic and used it to analyze traditional linguistic usages. Well, the text we're going to be examining, which is A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic, was a positivist manifesto, a manifesto of the doctrines that was shared by the famed Vienna Circle, whose famous figures were people like Otto Neurath and Morris Schlick and, of course, Rudolf Carnap, whose philosophic lineage was, at least according to Ayer, drawn from such previous empirical analysts as Berkeley and Hume. The text is, by Ayer's own admission, a, quote, young man's book. And it's full of bluff and bluster. It's a very pugnacious text. It's very powerful in its form of presentation as a straightforward frontal assault on traditional philosophy and metaphysics. So what I want to do in this lecture is try to capture some of that quality rather than just give you a straightforward rational reconstruction. Which means that we begin where Ayer begins, with a remarkable chapter titled The Elimination of Metaphysics. Now, this is a very bald claim that one is going to literally eliminate metaphysics. Ayer achieves this goal by analyzing the form of metaphysical sentences. He then tries to demonstrate that they violate the criteria of literal significance. In this sense, they will be shown to be literally nonsensical. Which is to say, Ayer wants to show us that metaphysical sentences fail to express the bearers of truth propositions. Part of this is the assumption that all propositions can be divided into one of two classes. They are either factual, what Kant called synthetic, or they are tautological, or analytic. So let's look at the argument Ayer offers us. Metaphysical sentences purport to give us a sort of extra scientific knowledge of the world. To do so, they must fulfill the criteria of verifiability for factual statements, if they are to be meaningful. And that criteria is not unlike what we looked at in pragmatists. Would any observation be relevant to the determination of this sentence's truth or falsehood? We might express this more formally by saying a sentence is a factual proposition if and only if there exists a set of premises and an experiential proposition such that those premises and experiential proposition entail our factual proposition. So one might take, for example, a existential proposition that I have an object and will release it. One might take, in addition, the additional premises of the laws of gravity. Those together should be able to allow us to deduce the fact that once I release that object, it should accelerate downward at a given rate. So the factual proposition then that if I release, say, this text, it will accelerate downward at a particular rate, would in fact fulfill this criteria. Okay. Which is a very formal way of saying the very straightforward fact that factual propositions are empirical hypotheses, which provide a rule of prediction for experience. Now note, when I say that they afford a rule of prediction as a sort of verification, this is a very weak verification. It certainly doesn't prove the truth of that proposition, but it does at least give us grounds to suspect that that proposition does bear meaning. So then we have to ask that question of metaphysical propositions. Take the sentence, a typical metaphysical sentence, the sensible world is merely a realm of appearance. Now, what experience could possibly bear on the truth or falsehood of that sentence? If it is in fact a veil of experiences, that would not affect our a veil of appearances, that would not affect our experiences one way or the other. We would still see the same things we do. In that case, we ask, well, what then is the factual content of that sentence to say that the sensible world is merely a realm of appearance? And in fact, there is no factual content to it, hence Ayer's conclusion that it is literal nonsense. The same could be said for the philosophic dispute between monism and pluralism. What particular implication would they have for our experience? To say that the world is ultimately one, or that the world is many. All of our experiences would remain the same in either case. It tells us nothing of the world that we didn't already know. In such a case, such a sentence is a noise signifying nothing. Which is to say, metaphysical sentences are, for Ayer, linguistic expressions without any cognitive content. They're neither true or false, but rather literal nonsense. So we might then define a metaphysical sentence as a sentence that purports to express a proposition and is neither a tautology, a logical truth, or an empirical hypothesis, a factual or synthetic statement. Ayer argues that the origins of metaphysics actually lies in a superstitious interpretation of grammar. Take, for example, the term substance. Ayer argues that our notion of substance arises from the grammatical form of subject and predicate, right? Which leads us to believe that every noun corresponds to an entity that is prior to its sensible properties or accidents. So we might then think of this coffee mug, right? It has a series of accidents or properties, smooth textures, a color, perhaps an odor. And because we have a noun that refers to coffee mug, we assume that there must be some substance, coffee mug, which bears those properties. But as a logical analysis shows, the thing, coffee mug, is simply defined as the sum of its properties. This was exactly the insight that Berkeley had shown, that physical objects are simply a conjunction of the experiences we have of them. In this sense, properties don't hang on the thing, they hang on each other. What unifies that coffee mug is the fact that all of the sensual experiences we have of it are always constantly conjoined. For that reason, we can eliminate substance as a sort of superstition based on our grammar. Similarly, Ayer argues that our notion of being arises in English and in classical Greek because in both languages the attributive and predicative sentences have the exact same grammatical form as existential ones. Let me give you some examples. I give you the sentence, martyrs exist. I give you as well the next sentence, martyrs suffer. That leads us to assume that suffering is a property, and since existence can serve the same grammatical function as suffering, that existence also must be a property, like suffering. Again, I'll give you another sentence. Peas exist, peas are green. This leads us to assume that existence is a property of things, just as green might be a property of things, i.e. peas. But as Kant had pointed out, existence is not an attribute. It is not a property. It is a claim about the reality or truth of a sentence involving the usage of that term. So in this case, this grammatical confusion leads to the replication of ontological entities, a sort of ontological slum. Take another sentence. Unicorns are fictitious. This gives rise to a whole host of what Ayer considers dopey modal considerations. Considerations having to do with the way our language works in naming. We are tempted to assume that for the sentence unicorns are fictitious to mean something, unicorns must in some sense exist in order for them to have the property of being fictitious, right? To serve the grammatical function they do. But fictitiousness, Ayer points out, is not a predicate, but a denial of existence. If you translated it into symbolic logic, it would not state there exists something that is both a unicorn and is fictitious. It would instead say, for anything you find, it will not be a unicorn. Hence the power of symbolic logic in allowing us to eliminate the confusions arising from our grammatical rules in natural language. And again, we see in this case that the problem here is that some philosophers assume every grammatical reference, every grammatical subject, I should say, must refer. And since such entities like unicorns don't fit into our world of experience, we create another world to house them. And that is the realm of metaphysics. Okay. Well, for Ayer, the function of philosophy then is critical, not speculative. It is not to create a metaphysical slum, as it were, but to help us criticize and learn the nature of linguistic usage. In this sense, we would say philosophy is not really a science, and therefore doesn't really offer us knowledge about the world. Hence, his argument for the death of metaphysics, right, which claims to give us knowledge of the world. Philosophy's proper task is to analyze various problems and issues, and more than anything, to clarify our linguistic usages through analysis. Consider the case of the problem of induction, right? How are we able to logically prove that on the basis of experience, we can predict that the future will resemble the the present and past. And his point is that there is no solution to the problem of induction, right? You can only deduce a principle of induction from an empirical or formal principle. But if you take a formal or tautological principle, then you're guilty of deducing an existential proposition from a tautology, which we know is logically impossible. But if you start with an empirical proposition, then you assume the problem which you're trying to prove, i.e., that nature is uniform in time and space, which presupposes the resemblance of future to present, which is the very issue of induction. The point is, for Ayer, you can't deduce the principle of induction. And therefore, induction is not a real problem at all, but a pseudo-problem. Because every real problem allows us, at least possibly, to search for a viable solution. And induction's validity cannot and need not be proven. It's based instead on its results. We believe in induction because when we practice it, we get the results that help us work our way through the world. So again, we're looking for a pragmatic justification there, not a philosophical one. Now, Ayer believes that, in fact, logical positivism is the culmination of a series of different movements in earlier history of philosophy. So there are, in fact, previous analysts, forebearers to the positivist agenda. Ayer mentions, for example, Locke on the problem of knowledge, the development of the Lockean phenomenology. Berkeley on defining things by sense contents. And of course Hume, probably more than any other thinker, on the analysis of causality and knowledge. Lesser analysts might include Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, even Plato and Aristotle and Kant. Why? Because they all use the same method of philosophical discussion, i.e. analysis. And his point is that the analyst is concerned with the way we speak of things and not the things themselves. Thus, the philosopher speaks of language, not the world, by means of definitions. And that sort of philosophy is a department not of science, but of logic. Okay. So the nature of philosophic analysis is to offer definitions for terms. Unlike, say, the lexicographer who writes a definition, the philosopher does not give explicit definitions, which are based on synonymy, but rather definitions in use. Such definitions will translate a symbol into equivalent sentences which contain neither the symbol or any of its synonyms. For example, sentences with material bodies as points of reference will be translated into sentences that refer only to sense contents. Sentences about numbers might be reduced to sentences that refer only to sets or classes. And of course, the best example of this is Bertrand Russell's theory of definite descriptions, which deal with sentences of the form the so-and-so, and translate them into sentences without that expression. There's a famous conundrum. Take the sentence, the present king of France is bald. That sentence clearly seems to have a meaning, and therefore people are tempted to assume that in some sense there must be something that the present king of France refers to, right? It must in some sense name a present king. Though there is no present king of France, therefore it must be a possible present king of France. However, Russell's theory shows us how to define definite descriptions in use and how to eliminate those. So instead, we would translate that sentence as saying, there exists something such that that thing is a king, is a king of France, is bald, and is unique. Once translated that way, we have no reservations in saying that sentence is simply false. Okay. Ayer claims that all literally meaningful sentences or statements express propositions. And these propositions are the sole bearers of truth or truth values. Such propositions are either analytic or tautological, or they are synthetic and factual. Now we know what analytic propositions are. They are raised for us by the problem of mathematics and logic. We have to account for them. And Ayer believes that these truths are absolutely necessary. But they're necessary almost by fiat, which is to say, we hold them to be true because of the conventional rules we have about the way to use and express such propositions. So they are true by the nature of the syntactic and grammatical rules used to form them. Thus, the truths of logic and mathematics are analytical or tautological, and therefore true by virtue of definitions. Hence, we could define an analytic proposition as a proposition which is true if, or a sentence is analytic if and only if its validity depends solely on the definitions of the symbols it contains. And to give you two intuitive examples, the statement, it is either raining or it is not raining, is true on the basis of the way we understand the truth value of the word or. It exhausts all possibilities, but it doesn't tell us any information of the world. Similarly, the sentence 2 plus 2 equals 4 does not hang on the reference of the word 2 or 4. It hangs on the understanding of the operator plus, the understanding of the relation of equality, and how we define 2 plus 2, or 2 and relative to 4. Again, analytic propositions have no factual content and only tell us how we use symbols according to our semantic or syntactic conventions or rules. Synthetic propositions, on the other hand, are empirical hypotheses. Unlike tautologies, we can never have certain knowledge of these propositions. We test the validity of them by seeing whether they enable us to anticipate or predict experience. Successful prediction increases the probability of such a proposition, and obviously a failure to predict successfully undermines its truth. Therefore, we must conclude that there is no absolute rationality by which we could build foolproof empirical hypotheses. Our grounds for synthetic or factual beliefs, in this sense, are purely pragmatic. Okay, we've delimited the range of literally significant sentences. They are either analytic propositions or synthetic propositions. Now we turn to the analysis of some of the traditional philosophic fields of ethics and theology, given this disjuncture. We could break ethical statements into 4 classes. The first class contains definitions of ethical terms, and such analytical propositions comprise legitimate ethical philosophy, or ethical philosophy proper. What do we mean by good? What do we mean by virtuous? What do we mean by moral? The second class contains descriptions of moral phenomena and their causes. These synthetic propositions comprise in part the social and human sciences, economics, sociology, anthropology, psychology. The third class are exhortations to virtue. And these are not propositions at all, but commands or ejaculations to prompt behavior. Do the right thing, while not always tell the truth. The fourth class contains ethical judgments about what are right and wrong. Such statements express neither analytic nor synthetic propositions. That is to say, normative ethical terms are not reducible to factual terms, but are rather absolute or intrinsic. And that's because they're really pseudo-concepts, and are in fact literally meaningless. The function of ethical judgment is, for Ayer, emotive, insofar as such terms evince rather than assert our feelings. Take, for example, the following sentence. I was wrong to belittle metaphysics. Ayer translates that as essentially saying, factually, I have belittled metaphysics. That's the only factual content in it. Well, then, what is the meaning of that expression, I was wrong? Well, it would be like saying, I belittled metaphysics. And that's the only content of that term. In fact, if we took it a step further and made it a universal judgment, it is wrong to belittle metaphysics, that practically comes out to be the same thing as saying, belittling metaphysics. How could you? Which expresses your feelings, your emotions, but doesn't give us any factual content about the world besides the fact that you don't like to see metaphysics belittled. So real moral disputes, those that have philosophical traction, are always about questions of fact. Disputes about ultimate values are pseudo-disputes precisely because they are in principle unresolvable. You think belittling metaphysics is bad, someone else thinks belittling metaphysics is good. How are we possibly to settle that dispute? So in this sense, ethical disputes are of the same status as aesthetic disputes. You have your taste. You like Juan Gris, you like Picasso. How are we to judge whose taste is correct? There is no such standard of judgment. It is a question of individual proclivity. Ayer believes that it's impossible to prove the truth of either of those moral choices, just as it's impossible in another domain, that of theology, to prove demonstratively that God exists, one of the great projects of Western metaphysics. Now, why can't we prove that God exists? Well, remember, empirical propositions are uncertain, so they can't produce a demonstratively certain proof. But a priori propositions are certain, but they're tautologies. And from a tautology, you can only deduce another tautology. So God can't be demonstratively, the existence of God can't be demonstratively proven from an empirical proposition, because empirical propositions won't generate such a proof, but his existence can't be generated from tautologies. Even more to the point, Ayer wants to show us that, in fact, the word God has no meaning in use. When we talk of God, we refer either to everything, the principle that informs all being, which for him is as good as referring to nothing, because if it doesn't distinguish, it doesn't actually refer in a powerful name, or we wind up talking about nothing at all. And that's because God is not a genuine name. It's not a proper name. So for Ayer, talk of God says nothing about the world or about the structure of language. And it's therefore neither true or false. It's simply, in a strict philosophical sense, nonsensical. Okay. So where then does this leave our understanding of philosophy, having eliminated metaphysics and God? And I would argue that in Ayer's conception, in a certain way, philosophy has come full circle since its reemergence in the thought of Aquinas. You'll recall that Aquinas had argued that philosophy is the handmaid of the queen of the sciences, theology. Well, for Ayer, philosophy, or particularly logical positivism, is the handmaid of science. I want here to quote very briefly, "One has only to consider the importance to contemporary physics of Einstein's definition of simultaneity in order to realize how necessary it is for the experimental physicist to be furnished with clear and definitive analyses of the concepts which he employs. And the need for such analyses is even greater in the less advanced sciences. For example, the failure of psychologists at the present time to emancipate themselves from metaphysics and to coordinate their inquiries, it's principally due to the use of symbols such as, quote, intelligence, or, quote, empathy, or, quote, subconscious self, which are not precisely defined. The theories of psychoanalysts are particularly full of metaphysical elements, which a philosophical elucidation of their symbols would remove. It would be the philosopher's business to make clear what was the real empirical content of the propositions of psychoanalysts, and what was their logical relationship to the propositions of behaviorists or Gestalt psychologists, a relationship at present obscured by unanalyzed differences of terminology." That has an implication that runs the other way as well. That also has implications not only philosophy serving as the sort of clarificatory discipline for scientific utterance, but it also has implications for the relationship of science to philosophy. But if science may be said to be blind without philosophy, it is true also that philosophy is virtually empty without science. For while the analysis of our everyday language is useful as a means of preventing or exposing a certain amount of metaphysics, the problems which it presents are not of such difficulty or complexity as to make it probable that they will remain long unsolved. Therefore, it is science gives to philosophy a project, a series of tasks to deliberate on, to help us clarify how we in fact use our language in scientific propositions. And this is critical because for Ayer, science is just a sort of self-conscious common sense or factual knowledge. So the philosopher then, according to Ayer, emerges as the sort of critic whose job it is to criticize our linguistic usage and help make sure that they are referential and semantically meaningful. And in this sense, as I've suggested before, Ayer has turned philosophy full circle. From being the queen, the handmaid of theology, it has now become the handmaid of science. Philosophy now exists to give charter to our scientific heritage, culture, and values.